Between Unreal's Material Editor and Sprout's extensibility, you're free to author any wind animation setup you need for your project. With this in mind, Sprout is built to facilitate the Pivot Painter wind workflow to allow for complex wind animation. Pivot Painter is a method of storing information about elements in our asset into the pixels of a texture, treating the texture as an array of useful data. Each element is given UV coordinates that act as an index into these textures. This information is then used within the material to animate the asset. The Pivot Painter wind material functions in Unreal use two textures. The first texture stores the facing direction, or x-axis, of an element in the RGB channels, and the size of its bounds along that direction in the alpha channel. The second texture stores the element's position in the RGB channels. The index of the element's parent is stored in the alpha channel. This lets us gather hierarchy information from within the material, allowing for a much more complex animation than standard vertex color wind. To build these textures for our Sprout, we can click the Pivot Painter tool in the Sprout Editor toolbar here. This will open a window that we can use to configure our Pivot Painter settings. We have an output directory where the created asset will be saved. Note that this supports auto formatting. We have an option for generating materials with the created textures. You can change the base material for these using the Base Pivot Painter Material property. Most importantly, we have the configuration options. The UV channel property determines which channel of our mesh will hold the UV information generated by Pivot Painter. This can also be set in the Sprout Actors details. Maximum Generations sets a limit at which any Sprout elements are merged into the same element. This is important, as supporting too many generations may increase material complexity. By default, the Pivot Painter wind materials only allow a maximum of 4 generations. Also, because of the image format, we can only store parent index values up to around 32,000. In order to maximize the number of allowed elements, Sprout sorts the generated hierarchy, packing parent elements first. However, you may still need to merge elements to meet the limit. We have some parameters available to us for controlling the Pivot Painter hierarchy. These are pivotpainter.exclude and pivotpainter.mergewithparent, which we can see in the parameter palette here. For example, let's say we wanted this generation of branches to be considered one element with the stem. We simply set pivotpainter.mergewithparent to do so. For elements that we don't want animated, like this trunk mesh, we set pivotpainter.exclude to true. Excluded elements will be set to index 0 in the texture. Returning to our configuration options, we finally have our texture options. By default, the first texture has pivot point in RGB and parent index in alpha. The second texture has x-axis in RGB and x-extent in alpha. As we said before, these are the textures used in the default Pivot Painter wind materials. Each texture may optionally specify an override name and whether to force the data to be stored as HDR, which allows for higher precision on stored data at a higher memory cost. The data functions themselves will specify whether they need HDR by default, so this option should be considered advanced use. The data functions themselves are overrideable in C++ and Blueprint, so users may create their own. There is, however, a very convenient way to create custom textures. We'll add an instance texture and choose Variable Input. This will allow us to store any attribute value in our Sprout into the Pivot Painter texture. Notice here that branch data and leaf data are separate. Now, we're ready to run Pivot Painter. We can see Pivot Painter has created our textures and some new materials. One material is created for each unique material on the Sprout, along with a base material that we can use to edit wind settings across all the generated materials. Depending on the materials our Sprout is generated with, there may be some texture assignment errors that need to be cleaned up. Now that we've generated some textures, an Enable Wind button will show up in the Sprout Editor viewport toolbar. Clicking it will replace the materials on the Sprout. Now we can edit the materials to customize our wind animation. If we make any changes to the sprout, we can click Update Pivot Painter to regenerate our textures and materials.